Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Today, we're going to be talking about farmers' decisions around practices and how information can influence farmers' belief around the technologies such as clover and multi-species swards. We know that agriculture is an important source of greenhouse gases, and with chemical nitrogen fertilizers contributing significantly to emissions and water pollution. So today we're going to be talking to Felipe Javier Aguiar Noury from Trinity College Dublin, and also from formerly Teagasc, and we're also joined by Méabh O'Hagan, who's going to help us out with questions later on. And Méabh, good morning to you. Philippe, sorry, you're not from Ireland. Maybe you tell us a little bit about yourself and
Yes.
the work that you've been doing. And apologies if I've made a complete mess of your name when I introduced you there this morning.
Thanks a million, Mark. No, you did an excellent job pronouncing my my very last name, my full name. So I'm Felipe. I am a postdoctoral research fellow now in Trinity College Dublin at the Center for Social Innovation. Now working in a EU Horizon project on the UMP Plus project on the adoption of nature-based solutions, but now for urban areas. Well, I'm Dr. Felipe Aguiar Noury now. I finished my PhD. I just finished my PhD at the University of Galway, former Welsh scholar with Teagasc. So it was through a Teagasc scholarship. I was based in Teagasc Athenry, the Agricultural Economics and Farm Service Department, and I'm originally from Ecuador. Previously, I got a bachelor's degree in economics from the Catholic University in Ecuador, and another bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Grenoble. And that would be it from my side.
So, Felipe, you have a presentation you're going to share with us.
So, well, first of all, thanks for having me here. Delightful to be in one of these webinars. The title of I'm going to give a talk about the research, the project that was conducted that I conducted during my PhD. The title was Exploring Farmers' Adoption of Greenhouse Gas Mitigation Measures that Reduce Chemical Fertilizer Application. Just to give an outline of the webinar. So first I'm going to start with the introduction, with the motivation around my PhD, a section about the background with the key policy elements that further motivate my PhD and that are relevant for in this context. Then I'm going to focus on the first main research question for my PhD. How did I address this research question? What was the methodology that was used, the main contribution and the findings? Then I'm going to focus on the second main research question. Similarly, what was the method that I used, the contribution and the main findings? Then to the third main research question, and towards the end of the presentation, I want to give a reflection on this topic, my point of view, and the conclusions around it. So my thesis was an article-based thesis. 4 articles has been produced from this PhD, which correspond to these 4 sections here. And so we can start with an introduction with a very important fact that global food systems are in crisis. And we can see this reflected on the news and in different articles. So a food system in crisis, for example, why is there a food crisis? Addressing the food crisis, food systems failure, the global food crisis, and the future of agriculture. And one of my favorite titles, Crisis, What Crisis? The Normality of the Current Food Crisis. So global food systems are in crisis because they generate over a third of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, contributing to climate change, while at the same time, climate change is a major threat to food production. We need to fertilize our land to produce food. However, in this crisis, the application of chemical nitrogen fertilizers are a particular concern, as they are the major contributors of nitrous oxide emissions. Nitrous oxide, a powerful greenhouse gas with a long atmospheric life. They also generate carbon dioxide emissions, methane emissions, ammonia emissions, which is an indirect source of more nitrous oxide, and nitrogen can leach into water systems with the potential to contaminate drinking water sources. And also, chemical fertilizers are characterized by having very volatile prices, subject to external events like Brexit, the COVID-19 pandemic. The clear example was with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, how we had those extreme high fertilizer prices, and now there are concerns among farmers in this second Trump's administration due to the potential tariffs around chemical fertilizers and how this translates into high fertilizer prices. In this crisis, the introduction of clover and different species, what is known as the multi-species sorts, into grassland has a key role to play, as they can naturally capture atmospheric N into soils. Therefore, they can reduce chemical fertilizer application. Therefore, they are a substitute for chemical nitrogen fertilizers. Of course, some associated benefits from this reduction in chemical nitrogen fertilizer application will involve lower emissions of nitrous oxide, of ammonia. It will also involve an improved water quality, and so on. Some economic benefits, for example, an increase in productivity, a higher animal feed intake with, for example, a higher milk production. They also have a greater tolerance to climate change, particularly in relation to the multi-species sorts. For example, they have greater tolerance to drought, to heat. Despite all these benefits, adoption rate remains low. So my PhD focused on this transition from chemical nitrogen fertilizers to the adoption of clover and multi-species sorts. Specifically, trying to understand farmers' decision-making processes related to this transition from chemical fertilizers to clover and multi-species sorts. So the main objective of this thesis was to gain, of my PhD, was to gain better understanding of farmers' decision-making processes related to the adoption of clover and multi-species sorts. First main research question was what are the factors influencing the application of chemical nitrogen fertilizers? Second main research question, what are the factors influencing farmers' adoption decisions about clover and multi-species sorts? And third research question, how does the provision of information affect farmers' beliefs about clover adoption? And we're going to see in detail this research question later on in the presentation. So we can go now to the background, and like from that big picture, from a general perspective, we first have, or at the EU level, we first have the EU's farm to fork strategy. And we note that it is setting a target to reduce agricultural greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030. It has been also set the target to reduce nutrient losses by 50% by 2030. This will involve a reduction in chemical fertilizer application by 20% by 2030. Overall, the EU's farm to fork strategy is trying to reach a transition towards sustainable food systems, towards sustainability. And in the farm to fork strategy, it is clearly mentioned two key elements to achieve this transition would be research and the adoption of innovations. Which innovations will those that will help us achieve sustainability, as they are producing environmental, social, and economic benefits. So these win-win-win benefits. And we can go now to, at the local level, in Ireland, we have Ireland's Climate Action Plan, with the general target to reduce total greenhouse gas emissions by 51% by 2030. A more sectoral specific target, for example, in agriculture, to reduce agricultural greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by 2030. And here we can see why it is so important in Ireland to reduce GHG emissions from the agricultural sector. This graph is very clearly that the agricultural sector has the largest share in greenhouse gas emissions in Ireland. It is the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, with over a third of greenhouse gas emissions coming from agriculture. To achieve these targets, a reduction in chemical fertilizer application by 26% by 2030 is needed. So very similar to the targets that were set at the EU level. Now, if we have a look at Ireland's climate action plan on the revision of 2024, we're going to see that the first measure mentioned in that revision was changing how we fertilize our land. So this is a key component to address the nitrous oxide emissions, ammonia emissions, and to fertilize our land more sustainable. In that same revision of 2024 of the Climate Action Plan, first key action, it says to support the adoption of clover and multi-species sorts. With the same importance, to also support the adoption of protected urea, and also of other practices that can reduce chemical fertilizer application, like liming, for example, low emissions, low spreading equipment. A more general term, for example, would be improved N efficiency. Here, for example, the Teagasc pasture-based Ireland app that can help achieve a higher efficiency in terms of nutrients in farms. So overall, in my PhD, I focused on these two, on clover and multi-species sorts. And if you're interested on having, and in general, if you have a look to the public policy reports in Ireland, they all tend to go back to the Teagasc MAG curves and to those reports. So if you're interested on the efficiency of these measures and the potential of these measures, the Teagasc MAG curves will be the main document, the main report. Also, great resource would be in the website of the Teagasc Signpost program. If you don't know, for example, if you don't come from an agricultural background, you don't know what protected urea means, then there you will have, they have an excellent page mentioning the sustainable technologies that can help us reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And just a brief mention to an ongoing project funded by the DFM, where Teagasc and UCC are collaborating. That is the Mid Change project that is not only focusing on those greenhouse gas mitigation measures that can reduce fertilizer application, but in all of them. And so I focused on clover and multi-species sorts. I already mentioned the main benefits and some benefits from them, that it will be the reduction in chemical fertilizer application, plus the environmental and economic benefits that I have mentioned. But so far, I haven't mentioned any costs of issues or issues of adoption. So the cost of reseeding clover has been estimated around 116 euros per hectare. But what would be the cost of implementing the multi-species sorts? So this will depend upon the mixture that is used, right? Upon the combination of species that is implemented. But to have an idea, we can look at clover and at the multi-species sorts program established in the DFM that is setting up subsidies of up to 300 euros per hectare for a combination, if I'm not mistaken, of chicory, plantain, timothy, and clover, of up to 300 euros per hectare, just to have an idea of the costs. Labor costs are quite important for implementation, but also for maintenance, for management. Here, for example, it would be in terms of weed control or grazing rotations. And we also have the issue of bloat, or the risk of having bloat in cattle. And bloat would be an animal health condition associated with high clover content and also with bad management, so bad grazing rotations. Bloat is a condition that impedes the natural release of gas in ruminants. So I focus on clover and multi-species sorts for 4 years. I would say that I have some knowledge or some expertise in clover and multi-species sorts, but there are people in Teagasc that have focused on clover particularly for decades. And so some experts in Teagasc have been focused on the outcomes of clover and now with more work on the multi-species sorts. But this has been summarized in the external assessment of Teagasc clover and multi-species sorts research program, and you can find some lead authors there. For example, Dr. Michael Egan from in Moorpark. He was recently in one of these webinars. We also have James Humphreys and also Deidre Hennessy that could be some names to look up. So we can go now to my first main research question. So what are the factors influencing the application of chemical nitrogen fertilizers? And I want to start with a problematic motivating this question. So we have seen that there are sustainable innovations that have been developed to reduce chemical nitrogen fertilizer application, that there is policy to reduce chemical nitrogen fertilizer application. And on top of that, we had recent high fertilizer prices for chemical nitrogen fertilizer. So despite, with these elements, we would expect that chemical fertilizer application will decrease considerably. However, global chemical nitrogen fertilizer application has not decreased significantly and is projected to continue increasing in the coming years. So we are still relying on chemical nitrogen fertilizers to produce food. One of the reasons behind this could be because of traditions. For example, how the application of chemical nitrogen fertilizer in the previous years is influencing the one in the current year. So my previous decisions in terms of fertilizer application is influencing my current one. This in psychology would be known as the status quo bias, where, for example, I prefer to stay the same rather than to look out for new alternatives. Like in more scientific terms, this will be known as the path dependence, as the path dependence effect, where in this case, for example, farmers will prefer to stay the same to keep with their same fertilizer practices rather than to look out for new sustainable alternatives. So this could be one of the reasons. This was one of our hypotheses here. So our methodology to answer this question was to estimate, because we want to analyze the factors influencing the application of chemical nitrogen fertilizers. In more economic terms, this will be what factors are influencing the demand for chemical nitrogen fertilizers. So we're estimating the demand for chemical fertilizers using the Teagasc National Farm Survey, this panel data from 2013, TNFS, from 2013 to 2022, where we're using static and dynamic models also. These dynamic models, for example, will help us try to test the path dependency for chemical nitrogen fertilizers. And then one of our main contributions is that we're testing this path dependency for chemical nitrogen fertilizers. There's a big literature around estimation of chemical or on the demand for chemical fertilizers in agricultural economics. However, they tend to omit the testing of this path dependency for chemical nitrogen fertilizers. So that is our main novelty. And we are also using weather data and analyzing the effect of weather data on the application of chemical nitrogen fertilizer. And the way that this weather data was obtained was by matching the spatial coordinates of farm. Not the exact coordinates, but a close estimate that will give us more valuable weather data that could be used for each farm. And we have an example here of how, for example, the chemical and fertilizer is especially distributed in Ireland. So main findings for when answering this question for this article, that indeed the past decisions are influencing current application. So a higher application of chemical natural fertilizer in the previous year is influencing the chemical fertilizer application in the current year, which has strong policy implications because farmers are more likely to stay the same rather than to look out for new alternatives. Because we're talking about estimating the demand for chemical nitrogen fertilizers, we're going to have different elasticities. One of them would be the price elasticity. And the result for that is that dairy farmers are still inelastic to price changes, even though we had recent extreme high fertilizer prices. We can also follow our income elasticity, and that will tell us, because it was between 0 and 1, that would tell us that chemical nitrogen fertilizers are characterized as or considered as goods of necessity or as necessity goods. So these are key challenges that could be taken into consideration from a policy perspective when trying to reduce the application of chemical nitrogen fertilizer or to promote the adoption of sustainable alternatives. And we also identified that the demand for chemical nitrogen fertilizer is sensitive to weather changes, to weather variability. For example, higher variability in soil temperature tend to increase the application of chemical nitrogen fertilizer. And here, just to remark the importance of improving the adaptation towards weather changes. And we can go now to the second research question: what are the factors that influence farmers' adoption decisions about clover and multi-species sorts? And just to start with the problematic again, so we have seen that there are farm outputs, there are benefits from adoption of clover and multi-species sorts, particularly more for clover established by researchers. However, adoption rates remain low. So perhaps some psychological factors may be behind these low adoption rates. So we want to know what are farmers' opinions, farmers' perceptions around these two measures. And to do it, we went out and talked to farmers. We ran a survey with close to 400 farmers and focus group discussion with farmers as well. And there's in one of the discussion group sessions that we had. Our contribution here is that we are analyzing future intentions to adopt and at the same time self-reported adoption levels. Levels because we identify adoption as a multi-stage process characterized by non-adopters, testers, and adopters. So, for example, we had this decision-making tree for adoption of clover and multi-species, where in the initial node, we have non-adoption, of course, and if we stay the same, we'll just keep being a non-adopter. If we choose to adopt clover and multi-species, we can be considered an adopter. If we just adopt the multi-species without including clover in the mixture, we're going to be a tester of multi-species. And if we just include clover, but not other species, we can be a tester of clover. And later on, if we decide to include other species into our sorts, we're going to become an adopter. And the same would apply to the multi-species sorts. If we don't have clover and then we decide to incorporate clover, then we're going to become an adopter. And this framework came out from my conversations with farmers. I identified one farmer that has a combination of chicory, plantain, and timothy in her sorts, but she didn't have clover, which gave me the idea that we have different types of farmers. And I made findings here. We focus on those psychological factors and perceptions. So these two perceptions are key: the perceived usefulness of adoption, perceptions of benefits, and the perceived complexity of adoption. More specifically, perceived usefulness of adoption would drive adoption decisions, while the perceived complexity will hinder adoption rates. More specifically, for example, what are the considerations in farmers' opinions regarding the main benefits of adoption? We'll have, of course, the reduction in fertilizer application. Other consideration, very, very important, is an increase in farm income, the reduction in carbon footprint, and even how the farm look with clover and multi-species sorts. In contrast, in terms of the complexity of the issues of adoption, we'll have the bloat risk. That will be the main consideration by farmers. We also have difficulties in establishment and management. That this involves a considerable learning process by farmers, and lack of information was another issue that was highly mentioned here, that is constraining these adoption decisions. And we also find that testers of clover are more likely to incorporate different species into their sort, to incorporate the multi-species sort. And we can go now to our third research question. How does the provision of information affect farmers' beliefs about clover adoption? And because we have seen that perceptions are important, and opinions are important. So now, how does the provision of information can affect farmers' beliefs about clover adoption? And to answer that question, we conducted a survey, an experimental survey with over 300 dairy farmers in Ireland. This included randomized information treatments in the survey. And if I give you a summarized version of the design of the survey, we basically elicited beliefs about the main benefits of adopting clover twice before and after providing information. So 3 stages. In the first stage, the measurement of prior beliefs. In the second stage, we randomly assigned information treatment. And on the third stage, we measured those posterior beliefs. How would that randomization work? So we had that baseline initial sample of 300 farmers, and they were randomly assigned into a control group and into treatment groups. One that we call it, that was receiving a scientific information frame, and another one with a farmer, what we call it a farmer frame. So our main contribution here was that because we are eliciting beliefs, that we combined qualitative and quantitative belief elicitation measures. So our results are going to be qualitative and quantitative. So main findings before providing information, that unfortunately most farmers don't believe that clover can reduce chemical fertilizer application. So they don't believe the main benefit from adopting clover. And this is a big issue to be considered, because if they don't believe that clover can reduce chemical fertilizer application, why would they adopt it in the first place? However, information has a potential to increase or to improve farmers' beliefs around clover adoption. And I want to show you how these qualitative beliefs will look like. For example, before providing information, the main consideration by farmers in their opinions, main consideration was bloat. So that was a big topic. Difficult establishment, difficult management, time-consuming work, and so on. After providing information, now in their posterior beliefs, we see some changes now. We, for example, have reduction, nitrogen, savings perhaps here. Not everything was positive. We still have the issue of bloat. We still have a wheat somewhere there, or difficult establishment, and so on. But that was a good first step. I would say that some more positive considerations can be achieved. And now I want to moving towards the end of the presentation, to move to that point of view article. The title for that article was a warning when promoting sustainability, changing attitudes or changing behavior. So I wanted to show this graph here on the left side, where we have the national end fertilizer application versus the chemical fertilizer prices in Ireland. So on our left axis here, we have the prices for can fertilizer, for calcium, ammonium, and nitrate, and for urea fertilizer, which are denoted with the gray and with the black lines. And on the right axis here, we have the amount of chemical nitrogen fertilizer applied in Ireland with this blue color here. And this is data from 2013 to 2022. If we focus on these last 3 years from 2020, 2021, and 2022, we can see that there was indeed a high spike on chemical nitrogen fertilizer prices, historic prices here. What happened with the application of chemical nitrogen fertilizer? Well, it decreased. It decreased since the prices, since that rise in prices. So we had there was a change in behavior. They applied lower chemical nitrogen fertilizer. Some farmers, for example, here who have been looking for new sustainable alternatives. And this was then a pressure factor, fertilizer prices. And similarly, we have, for example, changes in the nitrate regulation, in the allowances, for example. And recently we had the ban of unprotected urea in September of 2025. So there are these pressure factors that are reducing the application of chemical nitrogen fertilizer. Now, however, I'm making the case here that this is just a change in behavior, but not a change in attitudes. So their intrinsic motivation to look for new sustainable alternatives have not been fully engaged. So as soon as prices will go down again, or as soon as these pressure factors are eased, then chemical nitrogen fertilizer is going to rise again. So this is an unsustainable green behavior, let's say. And what happened, what I just found on the news recently, that fertilizer sales jumped by 11% very recently. So in 2024, it's not included in the graph, but in 2024, there was a jump by 11% in fertilizer sales. So prices went down again, and we are still relying on chemical nitrogen fertilizer. So basically, that these pressure factors may be inducing a green and yet unsustainable behavior. And we can go to the conclusions. So that is not saying that we don't need, or we may not need a stronger regulation. Unfortunately, given the current urgency to reduce chemical fertilizer application, a stronger regulation might be needed. And this was proposed before this took place, that straight urea has recently been banned since September of 2025. So policies is going towards this direction, but this has to be carefully designed. For example, one of the ideas that we're proposing here is that there should be a higher promotion on the subsidies for adopting clover and multi-species sorts, because it is likely that these are, or that the majority in the farming industry is unaware of these subsidies. That overall, there's this need to inform about the benefits of clover and multi-species sorts. And more particularly, because we have seen that their perceptions are important, we need to assure that the benefits of clover and multi-species sorts work. That will lead us to a higher belief on the adoption benefits of clover and multi-species sorts. In general, that to increase the adoption of clover and multi-species sorts, and in general, the knowledge transfer around these greenhouse gas mitigation measures should be a coordinated effort across all actors. So not all the efforts should be, or not all the pressure should be only on farmers or on policymakers and researchers, but everybody from farm to fork, which is basically what is telling us the farm to fork strategy. For example, we as consumers, how many times when we go to do the groceries, do we consider if that product that I'm purchasing was produced in a sustainable way or not? And that would be it for me, just some acknowledgements I would like to deeply thank the Teagasc Walsh Scholarship team. Particularly, I want to thank my Teagasc supervisor, Dr. Kaha Boglin, and everybody in Teagasc Athenry. If you're interested on this work, or if you have any further questions, this was an overview of my PhD. If you want more details, you can get in touch, and that would be it from my side.
Thank you very much for that, Felipe. It was a really good summary of the work that you've done over for your PhD. It's, I'm sure, hard to compress such a period of work into a half an hour slot, but well done on doing that. Just have a question there in relation to the test that you were doing, the before and after scenario where you'd provided information to farmers and they had changed their views to some degree. Could you tell us a little bit about how that was done and the type of information that was provided, and was it training or was it just printed information? Just would be interested to find out what the that intervention was.
Super. Yes, that is a key question. Yeah, because of how the presentation was prepared, I didn't include the information treatment. You will find it there in the article. But basically, the information was mentioning the reduction potential that can be achieved when adopting clover, when adopting the current recommendation of adoption. That was done using Qualtrics. So it was an online survey that farmers could fill out online. So it was a text basically.
Okay. And do you think that the results from that may have changed if perhaps it was a face-to-face type of an interaction, or where farmers actually spent a morning learning about clover and species-rich grassland?
Yeah, 100%. There are some limitations that are mentioned in that article that are normal with these types of survey experiments. One of them would be exactly if it is a face-to-face information. Also on the specific information that was given on that information treatment. And that is something that came out on the assessment of clover and multi-species sorts as well, that we have even within Teagasc different reduction potentials that have been achieved in different farms. It would also depend on each type of farm, because each farm is different. So, but like the amount of information that you can provide is very limited, and so that is another limitation. Yeah, like we are aware that every farm is different, and that it's difficult to provide a single figure of how much you can reduce chemical nitrogen fertilizer. But I think the important message was that you can indeed reduce it. And yes, another option would be, for example, instead of providing text, to try to provide a video, for example, or an infographic. That would have been valuable, perhaps.
Okay. You talked about the need for a coordinated effort there across across a sectoral effort to try to, I suppose, impart those messages. And we know that the Signpost program itself is an important campaign there to educate farmers around the benefits of clover and species-rich sward and so forth. Is there anything that you would recommend beyond that, or are there further recommendations coming from your study around how that might be delivered, or such a coordinated effort might be delivered? I'm just thinking about that wider agri-food sector. There are roles for particular stakeholders there.
Yeah, like in general, like there's gonna be, of course, like the effort is that it has to be put, like from a policy perspective, like for policymakers like there is an important responsibility in this regard. But like it could be helpful, for example, if we can have like demonstration farms with those successful cases around clover and multi-species sorts, but also like unsuccessful scenarios. Now, is I think knowledge transfer is a key situation. So not only what it has been done with the Signpost program, but knowledge transfer on it is key. So it's difficult not to mention it. I like something that and excuse me if I'm being repetitive, but I think that from a consumer point of view, there has to be something done there in terms of effort as well, because there was we are not prepared to spend more on sustainable products that sometimes they might be or they could be more expensive, or sometimes just to reduce cost. As consumers, we are not that prepared to value that much those sustainable products. I think that there's as a society there's a huge amount of effort that can be done to appreciate more farms that are implementing clover and multi-species search, or that are indeed like carbon neutral. That would be great. Yeah.
Okay, we have some really good questions coming through, Maeve, there from the audience.
Plenty of questions coming in there, Felipe. A really interesting presentation. I guess even just from my own point of view, something that really stood out to me in your presentation was that result that the majority of farmers don't believe that clover can actually reduce the requirement for chemical nitrogen. And to me, that stands out as a big issue that we need to address in the knowledge transfer world, Um, and I guess it does kind of highlight that need for the coordinated approach to try and deal with maybe that knowledge gap. I'd just be interested myself in kind of getting your perspective on, I know it's been incorporated now in policy that, for reseeds that you have to incorporate clover in that. But are we maybe missing a trick in that, yeah, the farmers are going to incorporate clover, but are they necessarily going to take the next step and reduce chemical nitrogen as a result of that incorporation?
Yes, that is all the points that you mentioned are very important. First of all, I would like to mention that what is happening with this underestimation of benefits, or that there's a lack of belief that they will work, is very likely that this is happening with other greenhouse gas mitigation measures, not only with cover and multi-species sorts. And what you say in terms of yeah, like you're told, for example, to include clover in your pasture. I think a key question is how much, and that is difficult to even to assess the level of clover content in the swarts. And I think my colleague was in one of these webinars recently, and one of the main considerations is that if you don't reach that recommendation level of 20% in your whole grassland area clover content, then you're not going to see all the benefits from adopting clover, and that is a big issue. Because yeah, reaching that level is important. Measuring the content that you have is important. Of course, if you're not reaching that level, you're not going to see all the benefits. And something that could be happening as well is that in that testing processing, you are still applying chemical nitrogen fertilizer at high rates, and that is not efficient. So yeah, there's some challenges still to be addressed here.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an issue that maybe raised its head a little bit last year with the way the weather was and clover contents were lower than normal. So maybe people who were testing out clover for the first time were trying to take a bit of a leap, and then the clover didn't perform, and exactly like you said, maybe the nitrogen application wasn't tailored based on the clover content at the time as it should have. And maybe there was maybe a bit of a lost opportunity there with some people. But yeah, no, I think it's we've a lot of work to do to try and build that level of awareness. It's a totally different ball game, I think, managing a clover grass pasture versus grass only. Just one of the questions as well that came in through the Q&A was in terms of by reducing chemical nitrogen fertilizer application, like how much of a greenhouse gas reduction would you expect to see on a farm?
So that's another key. That's something that we need to work on, and we're like there has been a change now. So we had it was before the FADN networks data. And now we are transitioning to this FSDN, to this sustainability. So some of the things that we need to achieve is to exactly measure how much greenhouse gas emissions we are reducing when adopting clover. I wouldn't know it out of the top of my head. I'm not too sure if that is that would be included in the Teagasc markers, perhaps, but there's definitely something that has to be measured. How much is the contribution, not only with greenhouse gas emissions, but also, like for example, with N leaching, how much we are saving it. That is important. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it maybe highlights the value of having something like the AgNav program there that we use in Signpost Advisory, because that can allow us to calculate out on a farm by farm basis if this farm reduces chemical nitrogen by 10%, 20%, for example, how much of an impact does it have on specifically that farm's greenhouse gases and also on its end surplus, which is directly linked then with the risk of nitrogen leaching too. So yeah, but I guess it's a difficult one to maybe quantify. It needs to be maybe on a farm by farm basis is more measurable, is it? I think there's a couple of other questions coming in there, Mark, as well.
Yeah, I suppose from my own perspective, we have we're doing a lot in terms of knowledge transfer. I mentioned the Signpost program earlier on there. Just be interested in your views in terms of those any other types of interesting initiatives that you've come across in terms of communicating these messages with farmers. Are there other recommendations coming from your study?
I think it's always key, the farm-to-farm communication, or peer-to-peer communication. I think that's a big issue. Now something that I because now it's modern times, right? Something I would have liked to look more into it will be into social media and what are the messages that we're sending through social media. Now, one of the recommendations that I would say in relation to communication that I think is very important is in terms of over information. That could also be another case that there's too much information around in general, that there could have been too much information around greenhouse gas mitigation measures. And that can be very difficult to assimilate if you have many different options just to reduce chemical fertilizer application. I show a few. So even in terms of that, just to try to have a more synthesized or summarized recommendations, that could be very helpful to a farmer.
Excellent. Okay. Well, we have actually a poll that we're going to ask our audience this morning just to get their views on some of the questions that you've raised there. We have a question there. The question is, what do you believe would most encourage farmers to adopt clover or multi-species swords? The option one is financial incentives. Number two is peer examples, advisory support is number three, and then clear evidence of benefits, and probably obviously a combination of all. But what do you believe would be the most encouraging? And we can see here the figures are leaning towards, I suppose, a balance between financial incentives and clear evidence of benefits. So that's interesting feedback there from our audience, because we do have a very discerning audience who are well able to interpret these types of questions and have direct experience of these questions. And we're keen to get feedback from our audience and their experience of what works with farmer clients as well. As you mentioned in your introduction, this is a significant challenge for the sector. We have a 51% target to be achieved by 2030. It's an ambitious target for the country, but we have to strive to meet these reductions. Very interesting. You talked about the elasticity there, or that relationship between price and nitrogen use. Could you talk to us a little bit more about that, Felipe?
Yeah. So I think that's like that was one of the things that I like the most, because I'm an economist. My background is in economics, and so what I mentioned is that farmers are, and I say they're still inelastic to price changes in fertilizers, because there have been many studies around the demand for chemical nitrogen fertilizers.
For the non-economists, could you just explain that term, inelastic?
Yeah, so that means that so the price will increase, right? And then that demand will decrease, okay? But just by a tiny bit. That will be in very conventional terms. So not largely, just by a tiny bit. That is why it is inelastic. There is a reduction, but is little. With the extreme high fertilizer prices, and I saw that also on the literature, that with the extreme high fertilizer prices, I would have expected a significant reduction on chemical nitrogen fertilizer application, but that shows how the food system is relying on them. They probably take up the cost by farmers, but I would have expected a higher reduction on that. Would you allow me to mention the other elasticity, perhaps, or was that?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And the other one was the income elasticity, and that was showing us that chemical nitrogen fertilizer was being characterized as a good of necessity. So in economics, we have these different goods. What it's basically telling us is that a higher income will increase the application of chemical nitrogen fertilizers, but also by a little, not too much. And that makes the difference that it is not a luxury good. It is a necessity for generating income, basically. And yeah, that would be my further explanation on that.
Okay, so we have the results in from our poll there. Fairly even breakdown there between the presentation of the clear evidence of the benefits, that's leading there at 40%, and then financial incentives. So it's a case of, I suppose, also using those other levers as well. Interestingly, that advisory support wasn't seen as a major influence there to encourage farmers, but I think that clear evidence of benefits will that would be translated by the advisors. I think they're an important channel for communicating those evidence of the benefits. We're just coming up on our past now. Felipe, thanks so much for joining us this morning. Really enjoyed your presentation. We'll try and have a copy of that available on the website over the coming days. And Méabh, thanks for helping with questions and the discussion. You're obviously dealing with this on a day-by-day basis, Méabh. So it's great to have those insights from you as well. So next week, we're going to be joined by Dr. David Wall and Mark Plunkett from Teagasc, where we'll be discussing or focusing on lime, the foundation of sustainable farming. So do join us next Friday for that session on lime.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series,
the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.